Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
This presentation is going to be on the temporomandibular joint, or the TMJ articulator, and the associated TMJ system that goes along with it. The objectives of this tape are: after the viewer sees this tape, he should be able to classify the TMJ articulator in relation to other adjustable articulators. He should be able to describe the articulator adjustments, the components of the TMJ system. He should be able to perform the techniques described in the sequence. He should be able to state the potential problems and shortcomings of the TMJ system and be able to list the benefits of the TMJ system. The TMJ articulator is basically classified as a fully adjustable articulator. In relation to other adjustable articulators, such as the Whitmix articulator, which is considered a semi-adjustable articulator. In the Whitmix articulator, they use mechanical equivalents for the condylar settings to set the superior wall and the medial wall adjustments. And on the other extreme, there's the Dinahr articulator, which is considered a fully adjustable articulator, which also uses mechanical equivalents to program the condylar guides. But here we have more adjustments. We have the abilities to program in Bennett movements, as well as the movements programmed with the Whitmix articulator. Now with the TMJ articulator, we also have the capabilities of programming in these Bennett movements, and thus it's considered a fully adjustable articulator, or potentially a fully adjustable articulator anyway. With this articulator, instead of using the mechanical equivalents to program in the condylar guides, molded acrylic is used in its place, and this is programmed in to give the desired mandibular movements to the articulator. As far as the other settings of the articulator, it's fairly straightforward. It has the capabilities of an adjustable intercondylar distance, as with other fully adjustable articulators. And it also, and all the rest of the settings are set with the molded acrylic condyles, or the molded condylar guides, as you can see here. Now, other adjustments of the articulator, as are fairly common with most adjustable articulators, it has provisions for making a custom molded incisal table. Here you see the blank, and this is puddled with soft acrylic, and you can mold a custom incisal table, or use a mechanical equivalent table similar to the Whitmix or the Hanau articulator. Now, studies have shown that the Whitmix articulator doesn't have the complete capabilities that the Dinahr or possibly some other fully adjustable articulators have, but in relation to the semi-adjustable articulator and fully adjustable articulators in general, it's definitely approaching the capabilities of the fully adjustable systems as far as what it can do and what it can be programmed to do. Now, other parts of the TMJ system include a mechanical equivalent condylar table, which would put it in pretty much the same category as the Whitmix articulator, because it's an Archon type articulator. And these are set with check bites, very similar to the other semi-adjustable articulators. It also has the provisions for using a kinematic hinge axis locator. You can use an arbitrary hinge axis, but also has the capabilities of locating hinge axis kinematically, so the true hinge axis can be located. And these are the different parts used in that location, which will be demonstrated later. The first step of the procedural sequence is the location of the true hinge axis. In doing this, we use a universal clutch to attach the lower member of the hinge axis locator. Notice that wax is placed in such a manner and that it has a two-piece construction that's screwed together to allow for easy removal of the universal clutch. This is attached to the lower jaw, and to this is attached the lower member of the hinge axis locator. First of all, this is filled with some kind of material, either plaster, as we're going to use in this case, or some kind of bite registration paste, and it's attached to the mandible, as we're doing here. Try to get it pointing out as straight as possible in relation to the patient's face. When this is set up firmly, we'll go ahead and assemble the rest of the hinge axis location equipment. Now we have the entire hinge axis locator assembled. We have the lower member attached to the universal clutch, which is attached to the mandible, and the upper member, which just fits like a pair of glasses over the bridge of the nose and over the ears, and is attached behind the ears by a rubber band. The lower member has adjustable side arms, so you can adjust to move the pointer forward and back with this adjustment, and you can move the side arm up and down by using these two adjustments here. Now, posterior to this, we have the upper member, as you can see below the pointer, which contains the grid for the actual location of the hinge axis. Now, the technique here involved is basically the same as all, or as most techniques anyway, for locating hinge axis. The mandible is put in the retruded position and opened and closed on an arc around that position. Now, by observing the movement of the stylus against the grid, we can tell how we want to adjust, make the adjustments of the pointer on the sidearm. And let's refer to this grid, or this graphic. You can see here that we're going to be on a arc around the true hinge axis. By watching the way the pointer moves, by watching the arc, we move towards the center of the arc, and eventually we'll end up at the true hinge axis. And this is a graphic illustrating how we move, or how we adjust the stylus towards the true hinge axis. Once this is found, we remove the upper member, which contains the grid, and we can now mark the hinge axis on the patient. First of all, we want to seat the patient in an upright position. And we're now ready to do the markings. We loosen the posterior stylus. Just put a small mark on the end of the stylus. And we can move this in to touch the skin and make our mark. Now, from this initial mark, we can go ahead and with our tattooing equipment, make our permanent mark. And this procedure is now repeated for the other side. The next step is the fabrication of the clutches for the stereographic recordings. First of all, we'll take our clutch plate, or our clutch former, and we'll put a little sticky wax into the little cutter stud holders. Then we'll go ahead and insert the 4 different cutter studs into this sticky wax, like that. Note that this is the maxillary part of it, that the bearing stud is screwed all the way out, and we'll also insert a small stimulent into this anterior notch to be a guide for insertion. This will hit the anterior teeth. This is just used as a guide when we put in the former into the mouth. Now we're ready to load the acrylic onto the clutch former. Okay, now the first thing we'll want to do to our clutch former is to spray it with a little lubricant so the acrylic is easy to remove from it. Then we'll go ahead and load our maxillary portion first. Now in loading this half, it's important that we get enough acrylic to completely cover the biting area and completely contain the cutter studs. But it's also important that we don't cover up the central bearing stud. We need access to that later. Now we'll go ahead and load the lower portion. In loading this portion, it's important that we completely cover the entire area, because this is going to contain our stereographic recordings, and it's important that we have enough area to do so. So it's important that we cover the complete clutch former. Out to the peripheries, as you can see here. Now we can go ahead and place this in the patient's mouth. Open, please. We'll insert it and use our stimulent as our guide, getting it so it sticks straight out of the patient's mouth, and guide the patient slowly together. Okay, bite down, please. Not right about there, hold it. Okay, now we'll want to watch the consistency of our acrylic and make sure that it doesn't start setting up and getting hot in the patient's mouth. Okay, open and close, please. Also, we'll want to make sure that we're not locking it into any other undercuts. Okay, hold it right there, please. Now, you have to feel this, and as it starts to get warm, we're ready to take it out of the patient's mouth and place it in some water. Once it is set up in the water, we'll be ready to take it into the lab and trim off our excesses, and we'll be ready to start our stereographic recordings. Now that we have our clutches trimmed from the lab, you'll notice that our mandibular clutch here is pretty much in the shape of the original clutch former. Again, the reason for this is to completely contain the total stereographic recordings. Notice also that there's some little lugs cut here in the front part of the clutch. Now in the maxillary clutch, you notice it's much smaller. Here, all we have to contain are just the cutter studs. Here again, some notches have been cut in the front of our clutch. Notice also that our bearing stud has been screwed out to allow clearance when we put it in the mouth. Now we're ready to try the clutches back into the mouth. Okay, bite together. Whoops. Okay, what we'll want to do now is have the patient move forward and back to the right and left and go through all our border movements. Okay, back, forward again, back. And we'll want to make sure that the only contact we have between the upper and the lower clutches is on the central bearing surface, that we've got adequate clearance for our cutter studs to make our stereographic recordings, and they're not in contact with the lower clutch. This would cause an unneeded and unwanted deflection. Once we're assured that our clutches are in the proper relationship, we're ready to begin our stereographic recordings. We do this by removing the lower clutch, Okay, just bite together and hold that. And we make 4 little puddles of acrylic that correspond to our cutter studs of the upper clutch. I think that should be plenty. Okay, now we reinsert this in the mouth. Okay, bite together. Make sure that our studs are in contact with the acrylic. Okay, now we put the patient through the border motions. Forward and back, forward and back, to the right, left, to the right and left. Forward and back. Now we need just a little more acrylic on this one, Vicki. We got just a little, not quite enough. Okay. Open up, please. Okay, together. You want to make sure that you have plenty of acrylic, but you don't want too much. Okay, forward and back, to the right, back, to the left, back. Okay, keep going through those motions. Okay, now this is one of the potential problems of this system in relation to other systems that use the pantograph, for instance. You'll notice that the vision as far as what we can see is very limited. With the pantograph, you can easily visualize the fact that the patient is consistently going over the same border tracings. With this method, we can't. We're pretty much doing it blind. Now also, studies have shown that the inexperienced operator is not as proficient in attaining the total border movement. Now this is mainly concerned with the full Bennett movement. It's difficult for the inexperienced operator to completely capture the total Bennett movement. So with experience, this system becomes more of value, and it also becomes more valid. This is probably one of the more major potential problems of this technique of recording. Now we continue this process, forward, back, to the right, back, to the left, back, until our acrylic is set. Okay, now once the acrylic is set, we'll go ahead, take them out of the mouth, and we'll relieve these stereographic recordings just so the clutches are just minimally out of contact. Okay, then we'll go back, we'll paint in a real thin slurry of the same type of acrylic, the TMJ acrylic, and we'll redo our recordings. Again, studies have shown that by redoing, and experience also has shown that by doing this in 2 steps, you can get a more accurate stereographic recording, and it's easier to read. Okay, now once we've completed our second recording, we'll use a ball of heated compound. Okay, stop right there. We'll place the patient in the centric relation position, and we'll take our heated compound and press it against this anterior region against our little jigs here. We'll show this when we get into the lab. Now what we'll use this for is just maintaining our centric relation position that will aid us in mounting the mandibular clutch on the articulator. So once we've made our compound jig, we've completed our second stereographic recording wash, we're now ready to take our clutches, or ready to take our face-bow relationship using these clutches, and we're ready to take it to the lab and program our articulator. Now that we've completed our second stereographic recording on the patient, we've gone ahead and reduced all the contacting areas on this clutch except for just those areas contacting the cutter studs, as you see here. We don't want any contact with the opposing clutch other than just with the cutter stud, these little cutters here. Okay, we've also gone ahead and taken our face bow off the patient using our clutches. Okay, we've aligned our side arms here, our little pointers, over the hinge axis recordings that we took earlier. We've also taken our third plane reference point, as you see here. This is a point just right of the nose. Okay, now the way we've hooked up our clutches, we've used our upper clutch in our original clutch former here, and we've used this for our face bow transfer. Now we're ready to take this apparatus to the articulator and begin our settings. Now the first thing that we'll go ahead and set is our intercondylar distance off this Facebook recording. The first thing we do in setting our intercondylar distance is we'll align the hinge axis pointers of the face bow with the little pointers lateral to the condyles on the articulator. We'll do this on both sides of the articulator until they're both in contact, and this is how we've programmed in our intercondylar distance. Now one thing that should be mentioned here, this is another one of the drawbacks of this articulator, is that it doesn't allow for asymmetrical intercondylar distance settings. Both condyles will be set symmetrically or centered from the midline. So if a patient has symmetrical intercondylar distance from the midline, this articulator will be very close. The more asymmetric the patient is or is in relation to the midline, the more discrepancy will be built into this articulator. Once we've set our intercondylar distance, we go ahead and we slide on these little guides and attach the face bow to the condylar members of the articulator. And with a rubber band, we can hold these together. Now we've got our face bow mounted to the lower member of the articulator. Now we're ready to start mounting the upper clutch to the upper member. We'll want to insert our blank condylar fossas in the condylar areas of the upper member. We've also put on our third reference point indicator here. This will contact the third reference point marker on the face bow. Okay, now we go ahead and place this on the articulator. We'll adjust it so our face bow is contacting this little arm here, and then we can support the upper clutch and the clutch former with a little support underneath here. I don't know if you can see that. Now we can go ahead and mount the upper clutch to the articulator. Once we've completed mounting the maxillary clutch, we can begin the mounting of the mandibular clutch. In this procedure, we'll use our little compound jig that we fabricated just following the second stereographic recording. As you can see, the little notches in the compound correspond to the little notches in the anterior part of the clutches. This we did by just heating compound, placing the patient's jaw in the centric relation position, which would correspond to the apex of our tracings here, or our stereographic recordings. And we just heat the compound and put it on the front part of the clutches while they're in the patient's mouth. This is used, as we mentioned, as a guide in mounting the mandibular clutch. So all we do is we now put the mandibular clutch over the cutter studs. So the studs are at the apex of our stereographic recordings. We attach the compound guide to assure that they're in the proper position for mounting. And now we can place the mandibular member of the articulator over this and proceed to mount the mandibular clutch. Now that we've got both our upper and lower clutches mounted to our articulator, we're ready to begin programming our condylar guide mechanisms. First thing we'll want to do is make sure that we raise our incisal pin off the incisal table so there's no contact. This will cause deflection when we're doing our programming, and we don't want this to occur. We want all our contact to be just on the clutch surfaces themselves. The next step we'll do is we have to relieve our condylar blanks. In mounting, there was contact there for the purposes of mounting. Now we've got to go ahead and relieve this area to provide adequate thickness for the acrylic that we're going to insert. The first thing we want to do is mark the top part of our condyle on the lower member of the articulator quite thoroughly with pencil. Then we go ahead and put the upper member back on. And put the articulator through the motions as guided by the clutches. Now we should have marks in the condylar blank area where we have to relieve. As you can see here, the pencil shows our area of contact. We don't want any contact in this area because it'll cause deflection. We want only just the soft acrylic in this area. We don't want any contact with the blank. So now we go ahead with an acrylic burr or vulcanite burr, and we can go ahead and start relieving these area of contact. Now we'll repeat this procedure until we get absolutely no marks in this condylar blank area. And we return the member back onto here. And we'll check for our clearance. As you can see, as we have on the opposite side, which we've already relieved, that our condylar ball is not, in fact, touching the blank, and that we've got adequate clearance for our acrylic that we're going to insert in there next. Once we've relieved both our condylar blanks on both sides, we're ready to begin the programming of our condylar guides. Darn it. Once we've double-checked that we've got ample clearance for both of our condylar mechanisms against the blanks, we can begin our process of programming our condylar guides. First thing we'll do is get our acrylic into kind of a doughy consistency so it can easily be handled. You can see here it doesn't stick to our fingers. It's in kind of a doughy condition. And we'll insert this into our condylar blank area and kind of pat it down such that we'll do this on both sides. Okay, now to ensure that we don't get this acrylic sticking to the condylar balls, take a little of our lubricant here again and spray the tops of this acrylic as well as the tops of the condylar elements on the lower member. Then we'll go ahead and place these two together. Okay, now we're ready to begin moving our articulator and molding our fasces. Now it's extremely important at this stage that we hold it in such a manner that holds the clutches firmly together. All four of these cutter studs have to be firmly against the mandibular clutch. So this is the way we hold it. So we're holding it on all sides with ample pressure. Then we begin going through our border motions as dictated by our stereographic recordings. Again, it's extremely important that we hold these clutches in a similar manner and that they're in contact at all times. Now, it should be noted that here is another potential for error in this system. As you can see, it's very difficult to visualize while doing this whether or not our cutter studs are in fact in complete contact with our stereographic recordings. We're only kind of guessing that in fact that's the case. Also, as the acrylic starts to set up, and also while we're doing this, it's very difficult to visualize whether or not the condylar ball is in contact with our setting acrylic at all times. So I think in summary, this is just another very potential source for error if we don't use extreme caution in this procedure. This movement, our right and left border tracings, and also our protrusive movements, and the areas kind of in between on our stereographic recordings, this movement is continued until our acrylic has set in the condylar region. Again, make sure that your incisal pin in the front is not in contact through any of these motions. This is extremely important. Once our condylar acrylic is set, we can go ahead and trim off the excess, and the articulator is essentially programmed and ready to accept our cases. Once the acrylic in the condylar areas has completely set up, the excess is trimmed off and the articulator is essentially programmed and ready to go. Now, in review of some of the potential problems or shortcomings of this system, first of all, while taking the stereographic recordings, you're pretty much working blind. You lack any discriminatory potential, as with the pantograph. You can't visualize what you're doing. So this is a potential problem. Also, with the inexperienced operator, it's very difficult to capture the total true border movements. And again, this is especially true of the Bennett movement. It's difficult to capture the total Bennett movement. Now, also related to this, when you're programming your articulator, it's again very difficult to visualize and see if your cutter studs are in contact with the stereographic recording surface of the lower clutch at all times. It's hard to see this, so you're kind of working blind again. And also in the condylar area, it's almost impossible, or it is impossible, to see that the condylar balls are in contact with the molded acrylic in the condylar area at all time. Now, one final shortcoming in review is the fact that as you'll note here, the condylar distances from the midline are always symmetrical on this articulator. It has no provisions for setting asymmetries into this system. So for the patient that's very symmetrical in intercondylar distance from the midline, the accuracy is going to be quite good. With increased asymmetry of the patient on one side or the other, the chance or the potential for error is increased. And finally, for the benefits of this system, it brings a potentially fully adjustable articulator and articulation system to the dentist that doesn't want to get involved with complicated mechanics, as with pantographic systems. It's a fairly straightforward and easily learned technique. It provides a articulator with a high range of adjustment that can be easily utilized by lab technicians, and by comparison to other fully adjustable systems, again, the pantograph and systems utilizing the pantograph, it is a relatively inexpensive system.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.